Boston Harbor, the night of December 16th, 1773. A group of colonists, thinly disguised as Mohawk warriors in a costume choice history has generously described as symbolic rather than convincing, row out to 3 ships at anchor and spend the next 3 hours dumping 342 chests of tea into the freezing water, somewhere in the neighborhood of 92,000 pounds of it, worth a small fortune. They are not protesting a tax hike on tea. The tea, technically, is about to become cheaper. That is precisely the problem, and untangling why an entire harbor full of discounted tea made colonists furious enough to start a chain of events that ends with the creation of the United States of America is, essentially, this entire episode. Because the real story doesn't start with tea at all. It starts a decade earlier in a London Treasury office with a very expensive war and a finance minister doing math that seemed at the time completely reasonable. If the idea that America exists partly because a British accountant tried to balance a budget sounds too petty a reason to found a country, subscribe now, because pettiness, it turns out, is exactly how empires occasionally lose continents. In 1763, Britain emerged victorious from the 7 Years' War, known in the American colonies as the French and Indian War, having successfully driven France out of most of its North American territory and secured British dominance across the continent. This was, by any military measure, an enormous strategic win. It was also, financially, an absolute catastrophe. Britain's national debt had roughly doubled over the course of the war, ballooning from around £75 million before the conflict to somewhere near £133 million by the time it ended, a figure so large relative to the entire British economy at the time that simply paying the annual interest on it consumed a staggering share of the government's total revenue. Britain had won the war and immediately discovered it had also acquired the 18th century equivalent of a mortgage on a house that had just burned partially down in the process of winning it. British ministers, casting around for someone to help cover this bill, arrive at a conclusion that felt, from London, entirely fair. The war had, after all, been fought substantially to protect and expand the American colonies. So surely the colonies themselves ought to contribute something toward the cost of their own defense, and the significant standing army Britain now intended to keep stationed on American soil to maintain order and deter further conflict. This is the exact moment where a genuinely reasonable-sounding accounting decision made by people who had never actually lived in the colonies they were about to tax set the entire following decade in motion. Before we even get to the famous taxes everyone learns about in school, there's a financial decision that rarely makes a highlight reel, but did real, structural damage. The Currency Act of 1764. American colonies. Chronically short of British coin because, unsurprisingly, most of it tended to flow back to Britain to pay for imported goods, had taken to issuing their own paper currency to keep local trade functioning. Parliament, worried this colonial paper money was devaluing and creating confusion for British merchants trying to collect debts, banned the colonies from issuing any new paper currency as legal tender at all. This sounds like a dry technical fix. In practice, it choked off liquidity in colonial economies that were already cash-strapped, making it considerably harder for ordinary colonial merchants, farmers, and tradespeople conduct everyday business, all to solve a problem that mostly bothered London creditors. It is the 18th century equivalent of a bank fixing its own risk exposure by simply making it illegal for its customers to use cash, and then being surprised when the customers get upset about it. In 1764, Parliament passed the Sugar Act, technically lowering the existing tax rate on foreign molasses imported into the colonies, but crucially paired with much stricter enforcement. Since the previous, higher tax rate had been so widely and cheerfully ignored through smuggling that it had generated almost no actual revenue at all. The logic here was, again, entirely defensible from a London balance sheet. A lower tax rate that people actually paid was mathematically better than a higher tax rate everyone simply smuggled around. From the colonial merchant's perspective, however, this was the first moment Parliament seemed genuinely serious about extracting real, collectible revenue directly from colonial trade, backed by expanded customs enforcement and a network of new vice admiralty courts empowered to try smuggling cases without a jury. Colonial merchants who had spent a generation treating smuggling as a mildly risky but broadly tolerated cost of doing business suddenly discovered the tolerance had run out. In March 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act, requiring colonists to purchase specially stamped paper for virtually every official document imaginable, newspapers, legal contracts, playing cards, even university diplomas, with the revenue going directly to Crown to help fund colonial defense. Unlike the Sugar Act, which taxed trade, the Stamp Act was a direct internal tax on everyday colonial life, and it was, from Parliament's perspective, remarkably modest, a fraction of what British subjects back home were already paying in comparable stamp duties. British ministers genuinely seemed puzzled by the scale of the backlash that followed, roughly the way someone might be puzzled that raising a coffee shop's prices by 50 cents caused a riot, without noticing they'd also just told all the customers they weren't allowed to vote on the coffee shop's menu. The colonial objection was never really about the specific amount of money involved. It was about who got to decide. Colonists had no representation in the British Parliament imposing this tax, giving rise to the phrase that would define the entire coming conflict. No taxation without representation. Stamp distributors across the colonies were burned in effigy, harassed, and in several cities forced to publicly resign their commissions under considerable social pressure, a remarkably effective grassroots campaign that meant, by the time the tax officially took effect in November 1765, there was almost nobody left willing to actually collect it. Facing a boycott of British goods that was genuinely hurting London merchants, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, less than a year after passing it, a genuine and rare colonial victory. In the very same breath, however, Parliament passed a declaratory act, formally asserting it retained full authority to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever, which is Parliament's way of saying, essentially, fine, you win this round, but we're still in charge, a sentence that tends to age about as well in politics as it does in most other relationships. Having learned that a direct internal tax provoked immediate colonial fury, Britain's new Chancellor of the Exchequer, Charles Townshend, tried a different approach in 1767, imposing new duties on goods imported into the colonies from Britain, including glass, paint, paper, and, in a detail that would matter enormously later, tea. Townshend's theory was that colonists, who had objected specifically to internal taxes on their own domestic affairs, might tolerate external trade duties instead. This distinction turned out to matter considerably more to London theorists than the colonists actually paying the bill, and another round of boycotts, protests, and non-importation agreements followed. By 1770, facing continued colonial resistance and its own economic pressure from British merchants losing colonial business, Parliament repealed most of the Townshend duties. But in a decision that reads today like an almost deliberately engineered plot device, kept the tax on tea specifically in place, largely as a symbolic assertion that Parliament still retained the right to tax the colonies whenever it chose to. This brings us back to that harbor in December 1773. By the early 1770s, the British East India Company, an enormous and politically influential trading corporation, was sitting on a financial crisis of its own, burdened by massive debts and warehouses full of unsold tea it desperately needed to offload. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, which was not, contrary to popular memory, a new tax on the colonies at all. It was more precisely a bailout, granting the East India Company the right to ship tea directly to the colonies and sell it to a small number of hand-picked merchants, cutting out middlemen entirely, which meant colonial tea prices would actually drop, even with the existing Townshend tea tax still technically attached. Colonial leaders saw straight through the pricing math to the political problem underneath it. Accepting cheaper tea meant tacitly accepting that Parliament could, in fact, tax the colonies without their consent, so long as the price was attractive enough, a precedent many colonial leaders considered far more dangerous than any specific dollar amount. It is the 18th century equivalent of a company slashing prices specifically to get you to finally agree to terms of service you've been refusing to sign, and colonial leaders in several port cities responded by refusing to let the tea ships unload at all. In Boston, when the royal governor refused to let the ships simply turn back to Britain, colonists made their own decision about where that tea was going to end up, which turned out to be the harbor floor. Britain's response to the destruction of the tea was swift and, in hindsight, spectacularly counterproductive. Parliament passed a series of punitive measures in 1770 for that colonists collectively nicknamed the Intolerable Acts, closing the port of Boston entirely until the destroyed tea was paid for, stripping Massachusetts of significant self-government, and allowing British officials accused of crimes in the colonies to be tried back in Britain instead of locally, among other measures. Rather than isolating Massachusetts as an example to the other colonies, as Parliament had intended, this response instead achieved something the colonies themselves had struggled to manage on their own for over a century. It made 13 fiercely independent, frequently squabbling colonies with wildly different economies, religions, and local governments suddenly feel like they were all facing the exact same threat. The First Continental Congress convened later that same year, drawing delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies, a level of intercolonial cooperation that a decade of British tax policy had utterly failed to produce voluntarily, and that a single set of punishing retaliatory laws managed to produce almost by accident. War broke out at Lexington and Concord in April 1775, and the colonies formally declared independence in July 1776. What followed was 8 years of war that cost the British Treasury, a figure historians estimate somewhere north of 100 million additional pounds, on top of the debt Britain had already been desperately trying to pay down when this entire chain of events began. In other words, Britain went to war at enormous additional expense, specifically reserved tax revenue from a set of colonies that, by the war's end in 1783, it had lost entirely, receiving not one further shilling from any of them ever again. If there has ever been a more expensive way to fail to collect a modest tax on tea and paper, history has not yet produced a more thorough example of it. Britain's finance ministers set out in 1764 to solve a debt crisis. By 1783, they had a considerably larger debt, no colonial tax revenue whatsoever, and an entirely new sovereign nation on the other side of the Atlantic that would, within a century and a half, become one of the largest economies the world had ever seen. The new United States carried this founding grievance directly into its own institutional DNA. The country's very first governing document, the Articles of Confederation, deliberately gave the national government almost no power to levy taxes at all, a design choice that reflected exactly how badly the previous generation had been burned by distant taxation without local consent, and one that, ironically, nearly bankrupted the new nation within a decade, since a government that cannot reliably tax anyone also cannot reliably pay its own debts, a lesson the founders had apparently needed to relearn firsthand rather than simply take Britain's word for it. It would take the ratification of the Constitution in 1788 and its stronger federal taxing authority to fix the very problem the country had been founded specifically to escape, which is either a deeply ironic historical footnote or simply proof that functioning governments and functioning tax systems have never actually been separable, no matter which side of revolution you happen to be standing on. Every individual British financial decision in this chain, taxing colonies to help pay for their own defense, tightening enforcement on smuggled molasses, restricting an unstable colonial currency, discounting tea to rescue a struggling trading company, was taken purely as an accounting decision, arguably defensible, and in several cases mathematically sound. The actual mistake, repeated again and again across 2 decades by a rotating cast of British ministers who never quite seemed to learn from the last round, was assuming that a financial policy imposed without any local political consent could ever be treated by the people paying for it as simply a financial policy. Britain kept trying to solve a numbers problem. The colonies had, the entire time, been fighting a representation problem that happened to show up on their bills. By the time London finally understood the difference, it had already lost an argument over tea, and, shortly afterward, an entire continent along with it. If a discounted shipment of tea turned out to be the spark that helped create an entire country, you might want to see which other historical small financial decisions ended up rewriting the map. Subscribe, and tell us in the comments which financial mistake in history you want us to cover next.